either by demons, ghosts, monsters, or all of these things together. There are ghosts in these woods. You will find things that you can't explain in these woods, and even if you make it out alive, you might not be fully sane today. Welcome to Tales of Dread. I have some scary stories that are supposedly true about scary things that live in our forests. Enjoy, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It was a short, easy story. This is how it went. If you were alone in the woods, especially after dark, a spirit might come to you. It would start to fall in love with you. You were from a different world than it was, so it would go after you. When the spirit in your clinic chose you, it would let you know by whispering and letting its hands fall. If you were picked by one of these volcanoes, you would be safe from any wild animals in the woods, and you would always get home before dark. It sounds pretty nice. As expected, though there is a catch, it would always follow right behind you, and if you turned around to look at it while it was following you, it would stop you and pull you back into the realm beyond, where you could never come back. At least, that's how the story goes. I never gave it much thought. Small stories like this made our small town more interesting, but sometimes you had to take them with a grain of salt. If we went for a walk in the woods, a friend might make a joke about us attracting a bulimic. But that was about as far as it went, at least when I was in my last year of school, which is the same as high school in my country. I remember walking home one day. It was fall. The air was crisp and cold, and the leaves under my feet crunched. I would often cut through the forest to get to and from school because it saved me a lot of time, and I rarely saw anyone else. On that day, nothing was different until I heard a strange sound about halfway between where I entered and left the forest. I had to turn off my music because it was so loud. So I took off my headphones and went to see where the sound was coming from. I looked up because I thought I heard something shoot over my head, but I didn't see anything. Then, just behind me, I heard another sound. I turned around, but all I could see were a few kicked up leaves. It looked like something had landed, but I couldn't see what it was. More leaves were kicked up as it seemed to take off again. Then I heard another sound. I could hear children laughing from it as it echoed into the woods and toward me. Even stranger, there were so many voices that it sounded like a whole class of kids were laughing at the same time in a formal way, and as soon as whatever it was moved away, the noise went away. Even though it was over in a few seconds, I was still confused. I couldn't make sense of it. I was sure that something had been tearing through the forest, but how could I not have seen it? And why would it have been laughing in that way? I didn't have a clue. Still not sure. I kept walking quickly and got out of the woods without any problems. I thought about that strange thing for most of the evening. I remember talking about it with my partner at the time. He seemed sure that it was a group of kids playing in the woods, but I was sure it wasn't. I didn't have any other ideas about what it could have been, so the subject was dropped. I left home earlier than usual the next morning. If you were me, you might have decided not to go into the woods at all. But I wanted more information. Even though I'd spent a lot of time in the forest, my one-of-a-kind experience made it seem strange, so if nothing else, I wanted to go back and see if I could find what I'd seen the day before. I walked through the woods, this time going back to the place where the encounter had happened while keeping a close eye on what was going on around me. Even the few leaves that were still on the branches were still. I didn't see anything strange until I got close to where I'd been the day before. As I walked between two big rocks, it felt like I crossed an invisible line. Even though I was wearing a long coat, a chill went through my whole body. I shivered, and another feeling came along with the cold. I suddenly felt like I was being watched, so I quickly looked around the woods, sure that a mountain lion or another dangerous animal was about to attack me. Even though there was nothing there, no animal or other sign of danger, I could still hear an alarm going off in my head, telling me that something was out there. As I took a step forward, I heard a crash from up ahead. Something landing on the forest floor made a clear sound that caught my attention. I looked up, and saw nothing right away. As I looked closer, though, I started to notice something strange. The leaves on the forest floor were being moved around. It seemed like someone or something was walking on them. As each imprint formed, I could even hear a crunch. I was very confused as I watched. It looked like something that couldn't be seen was coming towards me. Soon, it was clear that this is what had been instinctively watching me. I walked backwards and fell when I hit one of the big rocks I had already passed. I tripped over it and landed on the leaves around the ground as quickly as I could. When I got back up, I looked around hopelessly for something I couldn't see. It seemed like it had disappeared. Even though no one was stepping on any more leaves, and there were no strange sounds. I calmed down and took care of my nerves. I remember laughing to myself and trying to explain it away as something I had made up to make a point against me. Even so, I heard faint laughter that again sounded like it was coming from a group of kids. After that, I left, but not before giving the two rocks I'd been through one more curious look. I didn't bother to tell anybody. If I had done that, I'm sure I would have gotten in trouble for the next few days. I didn't understand what I'd seen. I am a person who thinks things through, so I did my best to explain it as a trick of the senses. A trick made possible by a very rare natural event, but I never really bought any explanation. I chose what I remembered the most. The next few weeks, I stayed away from the woods because I felt mean. Even though I couldn't see what it was, I felt like I was staring down a dangerous creature whose only goal was to hurt me. This was enough of a reason to go to and from school the long way for a while. In the end, it was December, and our town got its first snowfall. It was light and didn't do much but dust the ground and cool the air. I used to take pictures as a hobby, and I loved taking pictures of the trees in winter because they looked so pretty. I thought about what had happened to me in the past for a while in the woods. I wasn't quite over what had happened. I decided to go in the end, but only because my partner was going with me. Not being alone made it much easier. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, and if I saw it again, so would someone else. As we walked into the forest, I felt a little uneasy. It wasn't as scary as feeling like I was being watched, but it was still a strange feeling. I ignored it because I was ready to take some beautiful pictures, which I did. We did go on a scenic tour, though. I insisted on staying away from the general area where the two encounters had happened. Nothing strange happened, and I ended up with about 20 beautiful photos, including one with a bird in it. When I told him I was ready to go, he suggested we go get some coffee. It was cold outside, and the sun had already started to go down. So, without giving it much thought, I said yes and followed him out of the forest. I didn't realize quickly enough that we were getting close to the area where I had the strange thing happen. I wanted to say something, but I didn't because I thought it would be silly. After all, cutting through would save us a few minutes, and I thought I'd be fine with someone else. When I saw the familiar pair of rocks sitting in the snow, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I was really interested in them for some reason. They didn't do anything to catch my attention on their own, but I still went over to talk to them. I wondered if they had anything to do with what I had seen. As I walked between them on the now white trail, they didn't say anything. But in just a few seconds, That feeling of being watched came back. It was exactly the same as the time before. I looked right away for my partner, but to my horror, he wasn't there. He was only out of my line of sight for a few seconds, but I couldn't find him at all. As I walked toward him, I called out his name, but he didn't answer. I ran as I looked up and down the almost dark forest, but I couldn't find anything. No one. I couldn't stand the horrible feeling of being followed any longer, so I ran away in a random direction. I kept going and going. But I couldn't get away from it no matter how far I went. As I stopped to catch my breath, I heard something above me cut through the air. I could tell something hit the floor just by the sound. I looked over and saw that some leaves had been moved, but there was nothing that could have caused that. The woods had grown quiet, and I could hear footsteps over my labored breathing. I could tell from little things I could see. It wasn't more than 10 feet away. It was getting closer, and I was getting tired. I didn't run away. Instead, I just watched where I thought the thing was coming from. I fell backwards when it seemed like the wind picked up out of nowhere. Even though it was a cold winter night, it was loud, heavy, and almost warm. After a few seconds, it stopped. Then, I heard my name whispered right into my ear, which was very scary. "Thanks, Dad." Then I heard 3 sharp sounds, like something big and with hooves was stamping the ground right behind me. Now that it was only a few feet away, the thing I couldn't see took one last step forward that I could hear before it also stopped. I thought I was going to die because I was stupid enough to come back to these woods to wait while it seemed to stand still. Then, out of the blue, I saw his leaves all of a sudden fly up in a flurry. It wasn't moving anymore. It felt like I was being pulled away from it. As the invisible thing was pulled back into the woods, it left 2 thick lines in the frozen ground and made a sound that didn't sound like children laughing. Even though it was just a single boy-child crying. It stopped being noisy when the leaves stopped falling. I have no idea how long I had to wait there. I finally got up, but it was hard to stay on my feet because my legs were so cold that they were struggling to hold the rest of my body up. I didn't know what had happened, and even though I no longer felt like I was being watched, I could tell that something else had taken its place. Support that is always there. It felt like I wasn't by myself. Not that there was a threat, but it was nice, like a friend was with me. Then someone touched my shoulder. I wanted to turn around because I thought it was my boyfriend, but it became clear quickly that it wasn't him. It wasn't the norm. The heat coming from the hand seemed to take away all the cold from my body. Before I could move, I saw the frost on the ground in front of me start to melt. It didn't make sense because the temperature was probably below 0 at the time, and not all of the snow was melting. I watched as it slowly cut a path through the snow, about a foot wide, with the fresh colors of the grass and leaves standing out against the white of the rest of the woods. I didn't know why I trusted this, but I did. I followed the path, which seemed to go all over the woods, but within minutes I knew where I was. Again. Between the 2 rocks, it went. The same 2 people had been there before the event. As I walked forward, the warm hand on my shoulder gave me strength, and then I felt it go away. Just as I went between the 2 rocks, I fell forward. Warmth and comfort were no longer there. So quickly I quickly lost my balance. I got back on my feet, and I turned around to see what had led me back, but there was nothing beyond the rocks. There was no path of green grass, and there was no one or thing that could have put a hand on my shoulder. When I heard footsteps behind me, I didn't know what to do. My partner ran up to me and gave me a hug. I turned around and smiled. He started to ask me where I was and told me he had gotten scared and was looking for me everywhere with no good reason. I gave him a hug back. We stayed that way for a few minutes before we both decided to leave the woods because it was getting dark. That's the end of my story. I've thought about it for a long time and have a few ideas about what happened. I think the twin rocks were a barrier or a way to get to another place. I don't know what else to say. I can only guess what the thing was that I couldn't see but felt like it was following me. Even though I don't doubt for a second that it was trying to hurt me. This is what kept me safe. What kept me from getting too cold and led me to safety. I'm sure that it chose me because I was getting a colonic that night. I'll never find out. Of course. I often wonder what would have happened if I had turned around when it had its hand on my shoulder and faced it. Maybe I wouldn't be around to tell my story. Be careful when you're in the woods, and not just because there are dangerous animals and plants. There may be other things that Mama Bear did that we don't know how to understand. It happened when I was about 15 years old. My cousin, who was having a rough time, stayed with us for a while. He had just turned 21, so of course I thought he was the coolest person ever and wanted to do everything he did. When my younger brothers were in bed, we would often walk about 3 miles to the nearest gas station so that he could get a beer if we had nothing better to do. We both liked to stay up late, and since it was summer, I didn't have to worry about school. My dad also worked nights and my mom had died by this time, so it wasn't hard to keep it a secret since it was just the two of us. One night, on the way back from one of these trips, my cousin wanted to stop by the small church cemetery that we passed on the way to the gas station and see if we could pick up any strange activity. I live in a small town in Georgia, so there wasn't much else for us to do, and neither of us had a car. It didn't take much persuading, though, because, again, my cousin was older and cooler than I was. So when we got to the cemetery, I wanted to do what he did. I had a strange feeling, but since it was a small church cemetery, I didn't think we'd have any problems. I had been to a cemetery after dark many times, including on Halloween to see where my mother was buried. I was trying not to worry too much, but I could tell my cousin was feeling the same way. This will show how old I am, but this was before smartphones. At the time, a Razr BlackBerry or a Sidekick was the best phone you could get, and my dad was not going to spend money on one of those for me. My cousin wanted to see if we could catch some orbs on camera, but neither of our cameras were very good. After a while, we were almost ready to give up because we weren't supposed to be out this late. By then, it was between 3 and 4 in the morning. As we were walking back to the road, the air suddenly felt different, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Now, do you remember that this was in Georgia in the summer? So, even though it was night, the humidity often made it warm and muggy. Then I saw my cousin stop just ahead of me, a few feet away. I stopped to clean up. "What's there?" I asked, with a voice that was just above a whisper and had a few cracks in it. He held up his hand to tell me to be quiet. I remember biting my lip and going completely still in place. The air temperature around me dropped a lot, and I started to shiver a little. Dusty. I don't like this at all. It's time to go home. As I got closer to him, I took a breath and wrapped my arms around myself to keep warm. I remember thinking that I should have brought a jacket, even though I'd never needed one before. As I waited for my cousin to move, say something, or do something, I felt something tickle the back of my neck. I was starting to get scared at this point, so I jumped and turned around as quickly as I could to see what it was. There was nothing there, and I scolded myself for being scared in front of my older cousin, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone had tickled me before I could do anything else. I heard my cousin take a breath that I didn't even think was possible. Even though he was joking, he realized that when he said, "Go, run as fast as you can, we need to get home now," he wasn't being serious. But there was something creepy about the way he spoke. I looked where he was looking and had to do a double take when I saw what looked like a person with a hood walking away from us into the dusty trees across the street. "This isn't funny," I mumbled, my anxiety growing with every second that went by. Before I could say anything else, he said something to me, and we started to run out of the cemetery and back under the road. I was never very fit, and I didn't like running at all, but I managed to keep up with my cousin as he ran toward our house. At this point, we were still a mile and a half away, and I wasn't sure if I could keep up this pace the whole way. Still, I did it. And as we made the last turn toward my house, we were about to pass the horse farm on the corner, and then we'd be home free in my yard. We both stopped right where we were. A figure that was maybe 6 or 7 feet tall stood in the middle of the road. It was just standing there in the middle of the road. Its back was to us, and it was completely black. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I was afraid that if I turned to go into the woods, it would see or hear us before either of us could do anything else. I saw under the hood that the figure turned slowly and lifted its head to look at us all. With red eyes that were so sharp it felt like they were looking right into my soul. The rest of the room was pitch black. Even though the street light was close by, I couldn't see any details. We didn't move after a few seconds that seemed like hours. The figure eventually turned around and walked the rest of the way to the street, where he disappeared into the woods. At home, my cousin and I worked 2 jobs. When we got back to the house, I took the poker from the fireplace and slept with it that night, even though I didn't get much sleep. We never saw that figure again, but it was the scariest thing I've ever seen. After that, we lived there for a few more years, and I never saw or heard anything like it again. I don't know if going to the cemetery that night upset a ghost or if it was something else, but I hope it never happens again. Figure from the Woods by Russell The Menus. My grandparents own a few hundred acres of land in a small town in Vermont called Castleton. Nearly every week, my friends and I go up there to ride four-wheelers or play airsoft in the woods. Before a dark, cold night in November 2020, nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. We were just finishing up our last game of airsoft when we noticed that it was completely dark and decided to leave the woods. As we left, we stepped out of the trees into a huge field where you could see everything even in the dark. We put away our guns and started the car when one of my friends, John, pointed out something in the distance. I thought it was a deer or a coyote, but when he pointed in that direction, I didn't see anything, bro. I told him there was nothing over there, but he insisted and told me to look next to the camper. I squinted my eyes to try to see what he meant. Sam, my other friend, said he also saw it. We can't be more than a football field away from this camper. So it's making me mad that I can't figure out what they're talking about. Samson said, "Oh my God, it's moving." I was finally able to figure it out. It stood tall next to the camper and almost looked around it, as if it was trying to hide the fact that we were teens who liked to take risks. We started to walk towards it because we thought that whoever it was, we could beat them. But as we get closer, the figure gets clearer, so we stop and let it move. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, and its long arms looked like they were almost touching the ground. It just stopped moving and stood there, swaying back and forth, until the field was empty except for the wind, a light breeze, us, and the thing that was still moving. Then I heard a terrible scream that sounded like someone was being stabbed over and over again but not dying. We ran back to the car and slammed the door when the lights inside the car turned off as they should have. We could see outside better again. As we all looked out the right side of the car trying to find it again, I quietly said, "Hey, guys, look, it's not over there anymore." We heard something tap. We looked at each other in shock and tried to figure out where the tapping was coming from. John started to scream and point to the back of the car all of a sudden. When we look, we see the person standing there, with its face just a few inches from the window. It didn't actually have a face, but I call that part of its body its face to describe it. It was just a dark shape that looked like a person. Then it yelled so loudly that we had to put our hands over our ears. It wasn't just a regular scream. I knew what it was. I thought I heard John. The scream he had just made 2 minutes before. It now came from this person, but it was 10 times louder. I told Sam to step on it so we could get back to the house. I turned around quickly to look out the window to see what it would do next. It was hard to tell, but it looked like it was waving, not like a goodbye wave but more like a see you next time wave. We were scared and shaken when we got back to my grandparents' house. My grandmother asked us, "What's wrong, boys?" We all started to tell her what we had seen and what had happened, and we all wondered how she hadn't heard that scream. Her face got very serious, and she said, "You guys should probably stay the night tonight. We accepted her offer. We both agreed that there was no way we would drive out on that road in the middle of the night with woods on both sides just to forget about it. We all got together to play a game of Monopoly. Around 10 o'clock. We have been playing for a few hours now. When we heard a tapping sound, everyone jumped up and ran to the window. When we turned on the light outside, the same person was there again. It was standing next to the car, and it was clear that it was taller than the car. It started to walk away, but it kept facing us the whole time, making it clear that he was still there. Then it ran backwards on all fours. We couldn't believe it. We all thought this was impossible. We just slightly opened the window to see if we could hear anything else. And all we could hear was John's screams in the distance. We closed the window and decided that we would never play airsoft at night here again. It's been a year, and nothing strange has happened since then. I know it's out there, though. Maybe it's watching us in the woods, hoping we'll stay until nightfall again. The next story is that famous Korean 4chan story that I took down a long time ago, but people kept asking me to put it back up. So, everyone, here it is for you to enjoy. Also, the story is very much about ghosts in the woods. Hi ex long-time lurker. First time posting here. If you're interested in scary things from the Far East, you should talk to me. My parents, who are of German descent, moved to Korea before I was born because my dad went on business trips a lot and there was general conflict between them. My Korean friends and family pretty much raised me as their own child. My new family is crazy and superstitious, which is strange because most people in the country now believe in Christianity. However, they did live in the mountains with Korean family for most of my childhood before moving to the city when I was in high school. I didn't think any of this was creepy when it happened to me, it was just part of my life. But I recently moved to the US, and when I tell my new friends about things that happened to me as a child, they freak out. I guess I'll post a couple and see if anyone is interested. Here's some background information. My foster family is made up of people from North Korea. During the Korean War, they all fell. There is a superstitious grandfather, a Christian grandmother, and my parents' friends, the mother and father, who have always wanted to get out of the mountains as soon as possible. There was a daughter my age who was pretty much my only friend. The grandfather is the patriarch, and what he says goes. This includes all kinds of weird traditional ceremonies and rituals and a lot of creepy hiking and fishing trips. In general, this family is pretty chill. The grandfather's superstitious nonsense does cause a lot of trouble, though, and you can kind of see the mom going crazy over the years. We lived in the middle of nowhere for no clear reason. To get to the next town, you have to drive for about 30 minutes. Sorry if this is all jumbled up, but this is the first time I've tried to make sense. Think about it and write it down. This is about a yearly tradition we used to have. Some families in the city also do it, but none of my other Korean friends have gone through what I did. On the day his ancestors died, my grandfather would set up a small shrine and cook a ton of food. It always had to be a certain type of dish and had to be set up by size and color. After putting the food on special tables in the living room, Grandpa read a handwritten letter that basically said, "Everyone misses you and wants you to get some rest." Well, take this food offering in peace, and then burn it. He would sometimes say something about me, like please excuse the blonde boy. We are looking after him, because the ritual is usually only done by family. Everyone in turn bowed in a special way for a ceremony. When everyone was done bowing, Grandpa turned off all the lights, and everyone hid in the kitchen for about half an hour. Before you leave, you always have to clear your throat so you don't scare the dead. Grandpa says that the food was never eaten all the way. When we went back to the small shrine, the tools would be dirty and the seat cushions would be warm. When I was about 6 years old, my mom got tired of making the same dishes over and over again. They took up a lot of time. They took her all day to make, so this year she made ones that were easier. Grandfather gets very angry, but we don't have time to do everything over again. Do you know what you've done and everything else? We finished bowing and went to hide in the kitchen as usual, but we could hear rattling and banging from the living room, where the shrine is. The kids were scared, so my daughter and I held on to the grandfather while he swore under his breath. After an hour, the sound stops. Grandpa clears his throat and walks out of the kitchen into the living room. What a muddle! The dishes are upside down, the candles are out, and there is something that looks like dried blood or watery poop. After that, I can't remember what is all over the shrine. The mom always made the right food, so 9 told Fox's man, those things are creepy as heck, but the media always portrays them as some kind of busty, cutie pie furry's wet dream. I was 13 and living in the mountains. We couldn't get our hands on anything, but that didn't stop me from figuring out how to make myself happy. One day, I'll go into the mountains with my daughter, who we'll call Jean, to look for mushrooms. Just to be safe, I bring one of the family's Jindo dogs. These things are as safe as can be. We're having fun playing around when Oguchi Jindo starts to bark like crazy. When we turn around, we see a girl who looks like a teenager but is dressed in old clothes just standing there. But since we live in the country, we didn't even give it a second thought. We go over to say hi because we were glad to see someone our age. The new girl says that her family moved about 15 minutes away and into the empty lot. Goo still barks at her, but we don't pay attention to it. He is just being careful. We spend some time with her, and she keeps touching me and making comments about my hair and eyes, saying that I look cute and exotic. I was really confused. The sun is starting to set. So, we asked her if she wanted to join us for dinner. No, she says, but if he wants to see my room, he can only do so if he is not a non. It's getting dark, and I feel like being a brother. So I tell the new girl that I'll stop by later, but I have to take Jean home first. We tell grandfather what happened later. You stupid boy. You can't buy that empty piece of land. From then on, he tells us to always bring a Jean Doe with us. But we see that girl a few more times later that week. Each time I see her, I find her more and more attractive. We just go home because the dogs are barking at her. When we saw her, we'd go home and tell our grandfather. A few days later, the dog would bring home a fox he had killed, and we never saw that girl again. In essence, nine-tailed foxes Gumiho can change into women, whose bodies they eat. They seduce and kill men, then eat their livers. People say that once they eat 1,000 livers, they will turn into real people. Grandfather told me when I was young that there are two kinds of ghosts, those that are friendly and those that are mean and usually just want to die. There was a small lake near where we lived. Our grandfather always told us to go to Jindo when we went near the lake because there was a Gui Shin who lived there. People who live in bodies of water are called Movil Grecians, but this one was also a yoga session for a woman who had been wronged. From far away, you can see a young-looking woman who looks drenched as hell, just sitting on the dock. I've always thought she seemed sad. Sad. Not at all angry. She didn't do much, but whenever she saw the white Jindo named Jingyu, she kind of hissed like a cat and ran away. I was 9 years old when I got the courage to walk down to the lake. Even though it was still pretty far away, I could see Guishin sitting on the dock again. I say something like, "Hey, lady, how are you?" The Guishin stands up and moves toward me. When I say walking, it was more like a mix of walking and gliding, like when you stand still and watch someone go through one of those moving airport runways. The Guishin keeps getting closer, and all of a sudden I remembered that I forgot to bring a white Jindo crap. I think Guishin is close now because I can see that her face is dark and melted together, like ink and water mixing. Now, when I scream, she does too, but she stops when I do and just kind of watches me. She makes a strange gurgling sound, like someone trying to laugh underwater. Red is yellow, and she walks/glides back to the dock. I run home the whole way. The next day, there was a cool, fresh pee on my pants. Grandfather makes me bring food to the lake as a gift to the Greek gods, so they won't hurt me. I'd rather think that I brightened her day. Here are some facts about Jean Doe. The dogs we had were the national dog of Korea. They were kind of like Shibas, but they were bigger and tougher. They come in white, tan, and something that looks like black tan. They're tough little guys, but even though they're skinny, they can take out your legs like it's nothing. They're also very protective of their territory. They are just as stubborn. You can't train them like a Labrador Retriever to do cute tricks, sit for their food, or not bite annoying people. In Korean superstition, children will give their lives to protect you and your home. White Jean does chase away evil spirits, and Tangent can fight their way out of any situation. And Black Jean does make spirits see you as one of them. Jean's grandfather didn't get sick very often, because he was a fighter. So he had a lot of tangerine DOS and a few white ones for the kids. I'm pretty sure the shotgun he had in the closet was illegal because you can't own guns in Korea. Now, who wants a Korean troll? When I was 11, our toughest dog, Tangindo, died, so my grandfather got another one. He's a tough guy. Even as a puppy, he's loyal to his grandfather and Jean. When he's a year old, he's much bigger and stronger than the other dogs, so we call him super cool. Jean plans to go to the creek and catch fish one day. Grandpa tells her to get a white Jean doe, but she gets soup instead. I was helping my grandmother with some chores, so I stayed home instead of going with her. Also, I had the feeling that her mom didn't like me spending too much time with her daughter. A few hours later, we hear something in the mountains that sounds like a tiger. I asked my grandfather about it because I thought tigers were probably extinct in Korea. The dokkaebi are mostly just trolls from Korea. They don't really want to hurt people, but they are very strong and like to mess with people. Sometimes they make someone go crazy or kill them by accident. Even though the sun was setting, Jean and Sugu weren't home yet. Grandpa was starting to worry. Later, we see Jean running home alone. She's yelling that a hand with claws came out of the bushes and grabbed her. She hurried home. But the last thing she saw was Sugu jumping into the bush to fight whatever was there. Her parents tried to talk her out of it by saying that it was probably a lost person. Grandfather says, "You two are from the city and don't know anything. Why would someone who was lost be far from a town?" Then we see something far away run toward the house. It's really neat. He's got a leg in his mouth, for God's sake. It looks like a human leg, but it was much bigger and had thick hair all over it. It's not through the thigh, but there's no blood, just a weird watery splatter all over it, and a little bit on Sugu as well. Grandfather confirms that it's a doe named KB and throws the leg into the mountains very far away. As an apology to its clan, we left food out for the next week. As a way of saying screw you for the next month, they leave human-like poop in our yard. When you're a foreigner growing up in rural Korea, if you run into a ghost, it's either going to be extra mean to you or it's going to be laughing at you. They're not even going to try to hurt you. The closest school was a half-hour away, so every morning my grandfather drove me and Jean to school. Only 7 kids were in the class. Only 3 went to college. The rest died or went to live in the city. The kids were mean and picked on me a lot. They called me names like Yellow Monkey and Yankee, which was funny because I'm German. My grandfather didn't like school, so he let me skip it as long as I showed up for exams and did well on them. When I was 10, he gave me a white Jindo named Barko, which was made by Yakubu. One day, I went to the mountains to look for mushrooms and explore. When I hear rustling in the bushes, my cuckoo starts to cry and cower. Something that looks like a black dog comes out of the bushes. I stop in my tracks because I don't know if he's friendly or mean, but it's clear that Bikago is scared and peeing himself. It looked like a cross between a big dog and a leopard, but its nose was long and almost like a tree trunk. It looked like it was on fire, but there was no fire or heat. The thing moves its mouth in a snarling, growling way, but nothing comes out of it. I thought I was going to die at the time, but then I heard a gunshot in the distance and remembered that my grandfather had a gun that wasn't legal. Another shot goes off, this time so close to my head that my whole head feels like it's ringing, and I swear I see a bullet fly by. The thing chases after the bullet, but it's gone. I got out of there as fast as I could with my dog and grandfather. What I ran into turned out to be a bull gas. They eat fire and metal, and this one had made the deep mountains its home, so they are very dangerous. From then on, we weren't allowed to go that deep. One thing about Korean ghosts, both good and bad, is that they are very much like people. Most of the time, you can talk to them. If you just want them to leave you alone, you can trick them, scare them, or even make friends with them. The best thing you can do is start singing. My grandfather said that this might attract a okay, baby, but when I was 14 and going to school because screw it, I left my book bag in the classroom when school was over. Then Jean and I go outside to throw away the trash. The school didn't have a cleaning staff, so the kids had to help out. Jean will wait outside while I go get the bag. The teacher was standing with her back to the door and kind of staring at the wall. I tell her goodbye, but she doesn't answer me. I start to feel a little scared, so I go up to her and ask if she's okay. When she turns around, her face is gone. Dol Gilgamesh is one of our evil spirits that act like people but don't have faces. So, the name Doll Girl, which means egg, came from that. They usually leave you alone as long as you don't point out their lack of face or act disgusted. Anyway, the spirit acts just like the teacher and it's just heading way too close to the uncanny valley. Now I'm scared and angry because I was a moody teenager who just wanted to go home. When it started talking, it sounded just like my teacher. Annan, do you think I'm pretty? I thought, you don't even have a face, but I didn't say anything because ghosts can be dangerous when they're angry. If I say you're pretty, it will say I'm lying because it clearly doesn't have a face. But if I told it it wasn't pretty, it would say I was disgusted by the fact that it didn't have a face. I just wanted to go home and play with my goddamn dog and go fishing. So I started singing the national anthem of South Korea very loudly. The thing started screaming in an angry way. I hear the classroom door open and the screaming stops suddenly. Shannon, what do you plan to do this time? The teacher is standing in the doorway. Then I go home and whine about the GUI. By the time I was in my mid-teens, things had already started to go wrong. I think this was because my grandfather was getting old and weak, but it could have been because my emotions were all over the place and certain spirits could feel it. I was 16 and doing some yard work when I heard voices that I knew I had not heard in a while. I walked toward the voices of my own mother and father, almost crying. I haven't seen them since I was 4 years old, and the only reason I remembered them was because they called me every few months. I was angry, but mostly glad that my parents were standing at the edge of my grandfather's property and calling out to me, "Annan, it's us, let's go home now." So many things make me want to yell at them, but I feel like I can't. But then I remembered that my grandfather didn't tell me that my parents would be coming. I'll go get my grandfather first. I shouted, "Annan, won't you let your mother hug her own son?" I knew something was wrong, but I was too upset to figure out what. I started to cry and just stood there. The dogs were barking like crazy, and I could hear Jean in the house calling me for dinner. But my parents kept telling me to come over and give them a hug or go home to talk to them. "Son, hurry up. It'll take a long time to get home." I waited a moment. But where is your car?" They stopped talking, but soon tried to make it seem like a joke. But I kept asking. They got angry and started to threaten me with punishments, telling me I was breaking my mother's heart. I'm still crying and having trouble breathing, and I'm not sure if I should go with them or run back home. I think Jean saw me and told my grandfather that he was outside with a dog on a leash that started growling. The old Korean man then started to moo like an ox. "Leave my grandson alone, you crazy people." My parents made a sound that was a mix of a bird screeching and an old door creaking. They didn't come back out of the tall grass. Grandpa never talked about this again, and it still makes me a little choked up. Here's the story of how our toughest dog died. Some cousins came to see us over the weekend. One of them is about 5 years older than we are. The other boy is about 2 years older, and there is also a girl, but she just sits in the kitchen and does Bible study with her grandmother all day, so we don't pay attention to her. At first, we try to get along with them, but their cousins are too loud. They use bad language in the mountains and throw rocks at deer. We finally gave up and let them do what they wanted. It turned out that while Jean and I went fishing with my grandfather, these idiots went into the mountains and found a small family graveyard. Korean family graveyards are small, with only 4 or 5 bodies at most, especially if you find one in a rural area. Anyway, these people trashed the place by kicking down shrines and throwing trash everywhere. When they heard someone crying and got scared, they ran home. Grandfather was fuming, but he didn't say anything. He doesn't expect city kids to understand. For the next few days, we see angry ghosts at the edge of our property, hissing at the dogs but unable to get closer because we're white. We leave offerings around the property, but they're angry and won't stop trashing our vegetable gardens. One day, Grandfather looks really confused. Our most valuable tan Jindo goes missing. We think he may have gone hunting for something, since he hasn't come home in days. We finally go out to find him. This section has a warning because it shows animals being hurt in a very clear way. You've been told to fast forward about 30 seconds, so we find his body torn up and scattered around the trashed graveyard. His whole head is next to the broken shrine. Grandfather puts a towel over his dog's head to keep it quiet. He doesn't talk to us for a few days and just smokes his pipe on the patio while staring at the mountains. Even now, I miss that dog. In Korean mythology, I like to think that he gave his life as a sacrifice to save us all. Magpies are signs of good fortune and wealth. It's said that if you hear a magpie calling in the morning, it means you'll have a friendly visitor later in the day. I like to imagine that magpies were like guardian angels to me. My room was on the 2nd floor, next to the garden persimmon tree. Magpies are crazy about persimmons, and there are always a lot of them near the house. My grandfather and I have made it a habit to leave the persimmons at the top of the tree when we pick them, so the magpies can get to them. That was exactly where my window was. So I guess the magpies connected my face with food and a good mood in general. When I get home from school one day, I'm tired for some reason. His hack, so I take a nap. But the magpies won't stop calling. Some of them even banged and pounded on the window, which isn't something they usually do. Like an artist. I yell at the birds to shut up and try to sleep, but they're too loud. I stand up and storm out of the room to find a different place to sleep. When I turned around to close the door, I saw something stuck to the ceiling. It's a person who knows some kind of spirit. I keep looking at it. It turns its head toward me and gives me the most ugly look. But before it could react to me leaving the room, the magpie started calling and banging on the window. It starts to watch the birds. I run outside and tell my grandfather. He grabs a pot and a pan, runs up to my room, throws open the door, and bangs them together while yelling, "Get out!" The ghost hisses and slithers into the cracks in the wall. Before we moved in, we knew that someone had died in that house. We had no idea that the guy had killed himself in my room. We leave an offering out that night, and the next morning I sleep on the couch. The offering is gone, and the spirit won't come back for another 3 months. But when we do see it, the magpies squawk, and I think it makes my grandfather pretty happy to have his own army of magpies. Now it's time for the last story. I was 17 years old and I was getting interested in Jean. But we didn't show it because, A, it felt like incest, and B, her mother was completely off the hook at this point, so it would kill us both. One day, Grandpa goes to his berry patches and doesn't come back. We look for him, and a few hours later we find him lying on the ground. He looks calm and peaceful, like he just laid down to take a nap but never woke up. He died of a heart attack, according to the doctors. We're stunned. The man who took me in after my family abandoned me taught me all the things I cared about and kept me alive for all these years in a patch of mountain that was full of strange animals and spirits. He was gone just as Jean couldn't get over it. We were outside a lot. This was my grandfather's favorite place to fish. Not telling us much. We buried him on our own land. Jean and I clean the shrine at his grave every day. A few months later, my grandmother sells our house, and we end up moving to the city. All of the dogs, including mine, are being sold. I'm too shocked to keep living with my adopted family by acting like nothing happened. I was too mad to live with my real family. So grandmother gives me enough money to rent a small apartment barely larger than a closet. I couldn't focus on anything. So, I failed my tests to get into college. I barely made it by flipping burgers, working at gas stations, convenience stores, and stocking warehouses. In a way, it's more peace than I've ever known because there were no ghosts or spirits in my apartment. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Jean since we stopped seeing each other, and I knew that her mother was crazy and sometimes hurt her. Jean was also accepted to a good college at the same time. One day, we went to grandfather's grave to show him the letter of acceptance and do the ritual. The one about the food and things and how we don't talk to each other. The whole family came with us. It was getting dark, and before we left, Jean put her acceptance letter on her grandfather's shrine. Suddenly, her mother starts yelling, "He's dead. You crazy kids can't freaking hear you or see any of this nonsense." She says that her grandfather is crazy and yells at Jean for being so stupid to believe all of his nonsense. We tried to argue with her, telling her that she had seen a lot of the same things we had, but she was too crazy to listen. When she finally calmed down, Jean's dad took her back to the car. We just spent a long time sitting in front of my grandfather's grave. When we finally leave, I swear I can see something that looks like a blue flame flickering above the grave. Weeks passed by. I was making just enough money to get by, and I was trying to forget everything from my childhood. One night I hear incessant tapping on my window, almost like how the magpies used to tap. But that's strange because I lived underground and didn't have a window. I then feel a deep shuddering cold in my guts. I always thought it meant a ghost was nearby, but now I know it's just fear. I run wildly into the street and catch a taxi to Grandma's house. I can hear screaming inside the house. When the door bursts open, Jean runs out with blood on her arms and a pale face. You see something in her mother's head snapped and she had grabbed a knife, slashing at Jean. If you want to know about her father and her grandmother. Her dad went to see his family, but her grandmother was too scared to leave her room. Jean swears up and down that just as her mother was about to seriously stab her, a blue flame flickered out of nowhere and lit her skirt on fire. I did what I could to calm her down and called 911. After that, things got better. Jean and I realized nobody else would understand us as well as each other well. Next winter we're getting married. Her mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Grandma is moving in with Jean's and aunt, and I want to thank Grandpa for teaching me everything and making me a good person. I wouldn't be here today without him.